this episode I'm going to show you how I made this tambour door and the accompanying enclosure that sits behind the cupboard. Remember to leave a thumbs up below and subscribe, and I hope you enjoy the episode. I'll see you next time. I begin by measuring and cutting the opening into the cupboard before using a router to chamfer the edges. For the tambour door itself, I've decided, instead of using the Velcro mat, which is only 9mm, and that introduced a whole load of unnecessary complexities to the build, I changed my mind, and my dad's got this nice piece of oak that's probably been around, I think he said, for probably about 55 years old, and I'm going to use this for my tambour door. The first thing I'm going to do with this board is cut it into 3 along its length, and the reason for that is twofold. Firstly, there is a small amount of cupping in the board, and by cutting it up I can reduce the amount of cupping so that when it eventually goes through the planer I don't have to take as much thickness out of it. I'm also going to need to cut the board in half through its thickness, and if I were to try and do this now, I don't have a bandsaw, and there's no way I can do that on the table saw. If I just cut it in half, I might be able to do it in 2 passes, but that's not good enough, so by cutting it into 3 it's much more manageable. Time to plane some wood. So I've now got all of the oak cut down into the strips required for the tambours, and now I've got to cut them to length, so I'll get 2 from each strip, and then once I've done that I'll cut the rebate into the end of each strip. Now for the first time actually I'm quite excited. I'm able to use these tracks that I've installed on the microsaw station, and when completely finished there will be a measuring tape inside of it, but I can still use it by using this stop block. The stop block runs along the track via 3 bolts on the underside of it. 2 of them serve the purpose of keeping it inside of the track, and the 3rd one is attached to this knob. So when I've got the right distance I can tighten the knob up and use it to make repeat cuts. So I can make a cut, take the next piece, and I know that it's going to be exactly the same length every time. This in place, and tighten it up. That's not going anywhere. Now's a good time, just before you cut them up, just have a look at each end, because there is going to be a little wastage. So I'm looking for any that aren't quite as I'd want them. For example, this one is slightly narrower, so I definitely want that to be on the waist end. So just taking the extra bit of time to go through all of the pieces individually is really going to pay off in the long run. So I'm just going to take a very small amount off of the good end of each piece, because although they're nice, I don't know that they're square necessarily. I've had a play around with the wood and got it to an order that I like. I think this is quite easy on the eye. I'm now going to cut the rebates into the bits of oak. So here's one of the sample pieces I made, and I'm going to cut 5mm deep, and I need the notch to be 4mm, so 11mm this way. So this is achieved using the crosscut sled. What I'll do is I'll set the blade to the 11mm depth, and then I'll place a stop block 5mm back from the blade, so that when I make my cut, I'm taking that notch out, and then I can't go any further than that. And then when I want to take the rest out, I just move this away a little, make another pass, a bit more, and so on. And then I've got to do that for each end of every piece. So that's about 100 and I think it's 102 cuts or something. Now, something crucial that I must remember, a mistake I made on my prototype out of plywood, was that I glued the canvas onto the wrong side. The tambour door is going to sit inside of the cupboard and push against the opening. So my face is the same side as that I cut the rebate. So this is the front and this is the side that I cut the rebates. So I'm just now applying that curve to the end tambours, and I've done so by making a circle out of plywood that matches the rattle can that I used to trace the shape initially. A nice little tip when you're working with double-sided tape, because they can be quite fiddly to pull up. If you've got a few of them to peel back, instead of pulling the first one off and moving to the second, start the first one off, move to the next one, start that one off, and so on and so forth until you've got to all of your pieces. Then when you're ready, you can pull them all off at once and reduce the likelihood of dust settling on your tape. Step is to glue this fabric to the underside or the reverse of the tambour, and that it turns it to a continuous object that acts as the door. So now I'm going to cut my fabric. This is a calico cotton. It's a bit more dense than a bed sheet. There was a much thicker option, but it felt too stiff. So we'll see how this goes. All a learning experience. Wow. Right-handed scissors never work. With the tambour door finished, I now move on to making the spiral track in which the door will run. If you're wondering why there's been no episode for over 2 weeks, well, these spirals are to blame. They took forever. I totally underestimated the sheer amount of time and effort required to get this project over the finishing line. Initially, I designed my spiral in SketchUp and transferred it to some MDF for cutting, only then realising the 30mm guide bush was too large. I made myself a 22mm one out of an old chopping board. The next obstacle was choosing the correct material for my template. The MDF simply lacked the strength needed for my design. I had the laser cutters make me one out of aluminium. Finally, I made a start on the spirals. I chose a hardwood for good durability. The challenge here was to make one a mirror image of the other. That bit was easy, I just had to flip the template over. It was much harder to shape them to the van whilst keeping them parallel. This here that I've thrown together is a platform that brings the frame for the tambour door enclosure to the right height, so I've now got to make this the same shape as the templates. I used some scraps of 25mm hardwood ply to join the two spirals together, forming the enclosure. Because the door will spiral open, it's too aggressive a curve and I'll lose the critical space to get the largest loop possible. So to fix that, I'm going to taper this edge, and I'm doing that with a modified router base. Alright, so I'm now going to put the tambour into the panel. This isn't the permanent solution, it's just a rough job to try and get it finished for this video. These bits of ply prevent the tambour door from falling out when it's installed, and these little battens here ensure that the bits of ply aren't pushing down too hard on the door and preventing it from moving. So just sliding this in. I have had one, where's it gone? I have had one bit of tambour fall out. I used the contact adhesive and I followed the recommendations on the can, and it said ensure about 80% coverage, but that's a recommendation for something like auto carpet. For this, I probably needed 100% coverage because it's integral that each piece has enough glue on it. You can't have patches, otherwise they'll fall out like this. But I think for the moment, we might be alright. See, that's slid in now that it's held in place. Oh, look at that. I am very pleased with this. It's a bit loose, but that's just because of the way I've hastily put this together. But that can all be fixed in time. Another thing I was just thinking, in hindsight, the end piece could have been one strip instead of three. Then the curve would have been a bit tidier and I'd have been able to more easily attach a handle. But I've got what I've got and I'm very pleased with it. Now I'll also show you this in its complete form. Here is the stand that sits on the batten. Again, I'll find a much more secure way of putting this in eventually. Now here we've got the thumb screws that hold the light unit in, and the space is so confined in here that I had to trim these back on the mitre saw just so I could get the door going through the spiral and not catching. So that sits on there, and then the enclosure sits on top of that, and then finally the panel slides in over this. Go. And I know it's not going to go all the way back yet. There's something preventing it from going all the way. That's another thing I can fix in the future. As always, thank you ever so much for watching, especially if you've stuck through till the end. If you've not left a like, leave one below. I really appreciate it and it helps the channel. And again, maybe subscribe if you'd like to see more. I'll see you next time.